Guys, if you haven't already, you absolutely have to make sure for my brand new webinar called The 3-Step Method to Prevent Kidney Stones. In it, I share the top 3 mistakes that I see people make every single day when trying to prevent kidney stones. And of course, I'll share what to do instead. I'll also be talking about the exact step-by-step method that I've used to help hundreds of people stop kidney stones in my course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. Make sure to register for this free webinar at www.kidneystoneclass.com. I cannot wait to see you there. Welcome to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. After learning a ton about kidney stones and helping people prevent stones at the University of Chicago, I was fed up with all the terrible advice people were finding online. So I decided to do something about it. The Kidney Dietitian was born. This podcast is for people who want to learn what actually works to prevent kidney stones and still enjoy life, eating, and their favorite foods. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the 105th episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. As always, I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts, and I am thrilled to welcome another very special guest to the podcast today, Dr. Erin Miller. I met Dr. Erin Miller at the Rock Society meeting, which I talked about in an episode a while back on the podcast, and we had a few drinks together and had a lovely evening, and I wanted to invite him on the podcast to talk about a topic that I get a lot of questions about. So I think this will be a really, really interesting topic for a lot of our listeners. But just so you know a little bit about who you are listening to on the podcast, I have a very long but lengthy bio that is very warranted. So I want to make sure that everyone knows who you are before we dive into anything. So Dr. Miller is a principal investigator of the Urology Translational Research Lab at the Cleveland Clinic Foundation, where he leads research at the intersection of the microbiome and urologic disease. He earned his BS in biology from the Ohio State University. Have to throw in a quick go green there as a Michigan State grad, and MS in microbiology from the Nova Northeastern University and PhD in microbiology from Florida International University. So in his lab now and in his work now, he explores how the host genome and nutrition influence the gut of urinary microbiomes and how shifts in these microbial communities affect disease progression. So that's literally how our gut microbiome impacts kidney stone disease, essentially. His goal is to uncover new dietary, microbial, and small molecule therapies, as well as biomarker panels to better assess risk and treatment outcomes. He has worked on tons of different things, and I would love for you to give us a quick overview in layman's terms, all the wonderful things that you've done. But all of your work has resulted in 70 peer-reviewed scientific articles, 25 media highlights, and 25 invited seminars at national and international institutions. That is a mouthful. So thank you, Dr. Miller, so much for taking the time to be on the podcast today.
For sure. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Yes. So can you, in layman's terms, tell us a little bit about what you do? That was a mouthful. So describe for the general population what exactly you do at the Cleveland Clinic.
Yeah, so you covered a lot of it. So basically what my the research in my lab focuses on is interactions between both the gut microbiota and the urinary tract microbiota and urologic health. Particularly on kidney stones, but our research has really spanned or expanded to focus on wide areas of urology. And so really the kind of experiments that we do is we do a lot of clinical observation studies, but we also do mechanistic preclinical studies looking at the kind of molecules like oxalate that are modified by the microbiome. And we do a lot of microbiological assays as well. So looking directly at how bacteria do what they do and what they do. So our experiments are really defined by what's called like multi-omic techniques. And so basically like the omics part means that we try to look at everything in a particular sample. The multi part means that we look at all the bacteria, all of the metabolites, all the proteins, all the gene expression. And that's what really kind of combines to form that multi-omics. And so invariably, all of these experiments produce a very large amount of data. And so a big part of what we do is we develop and use a lot of bioinformatic tools to interrogate the data. And so that means a lot of computation and really kind of like very complex statistics looking at, hundreds or thousands of different variables at a single time to really try to tease apart, what are the most important aspects that, drive kidney stone formation, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like the specifically like kind of looking at trying to pinpoint exactly what's going on is especially important in the microbiome and seems impossible because the microbiome seems like one of the most complex area of research in my
Yeah.
right, because there's just like so many different bacteria, like literally millions, and they interact differently and like it's different for each person. Like there's so many different things to understand what's going on.
Yeah, and so that kind of, if you think about the human genome, there's like 22,000 genes, and people for de scientists for decades now have been trying to figure out, what do these genes do? How do they produce a particular phenotype or whatever? The complexity on the microbiome is orders of magnitude greater. And so if you think about, what is the microbiome, the number of bacteria in us and on us is about equal to the number of human cells.
It's mind
Um,
blowing to think about.
yeah, but 100 times the amount of genes. And so, really, what this means is that the microbiome provides an enormous amount, an enormous extension of our metabolic capacity, and it greatly facilitates or increases our metabolic plasticity. But teasing apart those interactions, like you said, is very, very difficult and very complex.
Hmm.
And kind of what we have found and what others have found is really, a lot of it has to do with how you categorize the microbiome, and trying to pull back those layers, like and try to identify like what are the most important functions that they provide, and how
Hmm.
those functions are defined, rather than just what are the genes that are there, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and that I'm kind of jumping ahead in my questions, but I wanted to ask you how you would define a healthy microbiome because I feel like, especially in the online wellness space, you'll hear people saying like, "Oh, take this for this healthy microbiome." Like, how I mean, sorry, I'm putting my opinion in here. How would you define a healthy gut microbiome? What would be your
Yeah.
response to that sort of thing?
So it's a really difficult question to answer. So first, I'll say that a popular term that is used not only in science but also kind of like out in the mainstream is dysbiosis. And
Mhm.
so when say like, oh yeah, dysbiosis leads to this disease or that disease, that term doesn't actually mean anything. They try to say, oh, it's like an imbalance in your microbiota, but
Yeah.
nobody
There's
can
no
define what that
definition of what
actually is.
that means. Yeah.
Right. And
Mhm.
so really when we, define what is a healthy microbiome, the way that, technically that how we do it is in case control studies, we have a narrowly defined healthy population that basically just means the absence of,
Known
what we're
disease.
studying. So they don't have kidney disease or kidney stone disease, they don't have chronic kidney disease, or they don't have like atherosclerosis or something like that. Again, that's a very like ambiguous definition. And so really, the way that I think about a healthy microbiome is what microbial functions are present in your gut microbiota. And so with the microbiota, you can have some bacteria doing good things and some bacteria doing bad things. And so like some of the good functions, for instance, is there's a lot of bacteria that degrade oxalate, which is one of the most common, compounds found in kidney stones. Or a big area of research in chronic disease are, bacteria that produce short chain fatty acids from like dietary fiber and things like that. On the flip side of things, you also have bacteria that will produce, I won't say the full name because it's a bit convoluted, but like TMAO. And so this is like the TMAO is produced from like red meats and like different compounds in meats. And that can actually increase your chances for cardiovascular disease.
Hmm.
And so, the way that I think about a healthy gut microbiota is what functions are present. So, like, do we have oxalate degrading bacteria, short chain fatty acid bacteria, or do we have, bacteria that produce TMAO and like uremic toxins?
Hmm. Yeah. So are there good things going on as well as not the bad things going on, essentially?
Yeah, yeah. And so I would say mostly, our bacteria provide beneficial or healthy functions, but really our bacteria don't care. And and really, what there's been some literature out there that I largely agree with, but um, trying to define bacteria in your gut, they care more about the other bacteria around them than they do about you. And
Certainly.
so really what they're trying to do is compete with each other. And for the most part, that either has minimal impact on us or largely beneficial.
Hmm.
And so sometimes on some rare occasions, it does bad things, right? Like it increases your chance for chronic disease or under very rare circumstances, it can cause, an acute infection or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So in general, having more bacteria and a wider diversity of bacteria is going to be a good thing because generally they do good things for us.
Yeah.
It's kind of a take-home message from what you just said, essentially, right?
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
actually a lot of data that support that idea. So basically, the higher your diversity in your gut bacteria, the better. Because it's kind of like hedging your bets. The increase in diversity helps to suppress pathogens.
Hmm.
It helps to utilize resources provided by the diet and things like that.
Hmm.
So in general, the higher the diversity, the better off you are.
Yeah. You mentioned reducing pathogens, I think, and that is kind of, again, going away from the main topic of this episode, but I think will be really interesting, especially in a post-COVID era. Um, the gut microbiome has a pretty big impact on immunity, right? And I know that's a very hot topic. So can you help us understand a little bit how in the world our gut microbiome, the bacteria that live in our gut, are helping our whole body be healthier and not be sick?
Yeah, so there's a lot of host mechanisms designed to kind of keep the bacteria in place. And so the idea is that our largely our immune system, in particular like our adaptive immune system, is trained on, bacteria that, you know, aren't that bad that they wouldn't cause like an acute infection.
Hmm.
And so they produce all of like the antibodies and stuff like that that can target some of these bad bacteria if the need arises. And that's like the one of the main factors I think that helps to where the gut microbiota trains our immune system to help to prevent pathogens if they do arise. I think another big part of that is also how our microbiota interacts with like dietary toxins like oxalate. And so, oxalate triggers the immune system as well. Like it produces a lot of inflammation and things like that. And so, based on what bacteria you have in your gut, they can degrade, all of these toxins and help to prevent or inhibit the immune
Hmm.
response.
It's almost like
So,
they're little
kind of,
natural vaccines going on all the time.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Not
yeah,
saying that
yeah,
we
yeah,
don't
they
need
definitely are.
actual
They
vaccines
help.
for the record, but it's almost, that's kind of what's going on there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Very cool.
definitely.
So to kind of help turn our conversation towards the urinary tract and kidney stones, I do want to ask you about the
Yeah.
urobiome because I feel like that's a term that probably many people haven't heard of, but there's a lot of super interesting research going on there. So can you give us a quick overview of what the urobiome is and how
Yeah.
that might impact kidney stones?
Yeah. So I would, well, let me take a quick step backwards first back to the gut microbiota, because there's a
Sure.
lot of interesting connections there in our research. And in fact, like this has been going on for over 100 years, but we think that, that the intestinal layer in our colon that provides a clear and distinct barrier between bacteria in our gut and then getting outside of the gut and into circulation. But there, in our studies and a lot of other studies, like I said, dating back over a century, they find that some small proportion of bacteria get into translocate from the gut into systemic circulation,
Hmm.
and the kidney is actually the primary target where those bacteria get out. And so, in terms of the urobiome or like the urinary tract microbiome, our data suggests, and there's still like more work to be done on this, that bacteria get into the urinary tract both through systemic circulation after translocation in the gut, but also by moving up the urinary tract as well. And so, the last 50 years, maybe 70 years or so, like 1950s, there's, they started doing this one clinical assay. It's called like the standard urine culture. And what these are, they're very heavily biased towards not detecting bacteria.
Okay.
And so like very, very low urine volumes. They only, use one or two different types of media to culture bacteria. They only culture them for 24 hours. And really, you're only going to get a culture if you have an acute infection, like a urinary tract infection that, bacteria that are, highly proliferative. And so this led to this definition or this idea that the urinary tract is sterile. And so, basically a lot of urologists believe that, if there are bacteria present in the urinary tract, then you have an infection. And that leads to a lot of issues in terms of like overtreating, urinary tract infections, but also a lack of understanding on what the urinary tract microbiome actually does.
Hmm.
And so in the last, 15 years, there's been a lot of research by our group and many others around the world that have very clearly shown that there are, if not 100% of the time, like pretty nearly 100% of the time, there's bacteria, a low microbial biomass community in the urinary tract. I would argue that the rare occasions where we don't find bacteria, that's probably a false negative. And so really, you know, this microbiota, it's a very small subset of what we see on our skin and in our gut microbiota, because like I said, they come from a couple of different sources. And so the gut microbiota can influence urinary tract health and kidney stone formation kind of indirectly, by modifying your immune system, by degrading dietary toxins or producing uremic toxins. The bacteria in our urinary tract actually have a much more direct influence on kidney stones and other urinary pathologies because they're right there. They're in at the site
Literally
of
where the stones are forming.
yeah, where the
Yeah.
stones are forming, or where some muscle spasms are happening, like with
Mhm.
overactive bladder and things like that. And so they play a much more direct role in I think the way that I think about it is the gut microbiota has a greater probability of determining if you get kidney stones, and then the urinary tract microbiota determines what kind of kidney stones that you get.
Okay.
And so all of our research right now, the way that we think these urinary tract bacteria influence kidney stone formation is that as they flow through the kidneys for excretion, some of those bacteria might get caught up in our nephrons, so like where all the filtration happens in our kidneys, and they can potentially attach to cells, form some biofilms, and actually trap calcium oxalate or calcium phosphate crystals.
Mhm.
And if you cut through a calcium oxalate kidney stone, you'd see these very clear concentric rings, like tree rings. And there's a lot of organic material within those between those layers. And
Mhm.
so what that tells us, and through a lot of like our bioreactor studies and stuff like that, we think that these bacteria form biofilms, trap minerals, and then form additional biofilms on top of that, that leads to this, expansion or growth of the stones.
Interesting. So it's almost like those Eurobiome bacteria are not doing such great things for us potentially.
So it depends. Like, so if we look at the urobiome between, what we define as healthy, so people that have never had kidney stones and those that have an active case of stones, there's very clear differences, and these differences hold across multiple different urologic diseases. And so I would say like, pretty close to 100% of the time, and like whatever urologic disease we've looked at, our healthy individuals have higher levels of lactic acid bacteria, so like lactobacillus and lactococcus and things like that.
Hmm.
And our cases, like people that have the kidney stones or overactive bladder or a number of other urologic diseases, they have higher levels of known uropathogens. So your E. coli, Staphylococcus, Proteus, and ureaplasma. And so depends on what bacteria are there. So some are good, some are bad, kind of like what I was saying earlier with the gut microbiota.
Yeah.
And but in all cases, when we've looked at, we've excluded infection. And
Hmm.
so like the same bacteria that are causing symptomatic infections at lower levels, we think are causing other areas of urologic dysfunction.
Fascinating. Fascinating. And is it safe to say that our understanding of how to modulate the urobiome for the better, especially, is minimal? We don't know a ton about what we can do to improve that.
Yeah, that's a big area of research that we're looking at now. So we do have very clear data, both from like clinical, microbiological, and like preclinical studies, that diverse antibiotics actually lower the sort of the good urinary tract bacteria and actually increase these uropathogenic bacteria. So that actually comes with a massive caveat that I would rather get a kidney stone than to have like sepsis or something like that.
It's as
Um,
terrible as kidney stones are. Yes.
and
Yes.
so it comes with the recognition that like antibiotics are critical for a lot of like clinical care applications and things like that.
Right.
But really, in order to promote a healthy microbiome overall, good antibiotic stewardship, I think is really critical.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of clinicians they think of antibiotics as kind of a no consequence kind of therapy, and they rightly see it as a critical part of their toolbox. But we have to recognize kind of as a field that there are implications for it. And a lot of the areas that we're doing research in now is trying to figure out after antibiotics, like how do you restore those bacteria,
Hmm.
and what can we do to kind of like bring it back to a healthy state.
Yeah. And that's where diet might come into play potentially,
Yeah,
which we'll talk about
absolutely.
later, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just want to say that the fact that antibiotics are associated with kidney stones is a very well-known fact. And it seems like historically we might have thought that was mostly related to the gut microbiome, but potentially there's a role of the uro microbiome in that connection as well.
Yeah, so we have, there's a lot of data that supports both. And so, for instance, like many of our oxalate degrading bacteria are also susceptible to antibiotics.
Hmm.
And so it kind of produces this double hit, right? So
Hmm.
it lowers our oxalate degrading bacteria, it lowers our short chain fatty acid bacteria, and it lowers our uroprotective bacteria in our urinary tract, right?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so now directly asking the question of the episode. How does the gut microbiome? So it's fascinating stuff about the microbiome because that's just like a very hot topic. I've been asked by the media about it, and when I'm getting more and more questions from my followers about it. But moving now directly to the gut microbiome,
Yeah.
what are the different ways that the gut microbiome influences kidney stone prevention or formation?
Yeah, so kind of like a little bit of what I said earlier, there's multiple ways that the gut microbiota influence kidney stone formation. And so one of the big ways, obviously we know that oxalate is, one of the main compounds in 80 to 85% of kidney stones. And there's actually a huge diversity of oxalate degrading bacteria in our gut. And so, in some of our animal studies with wild rodents, we found that like 60% of the species in the gut contain at least one oxalate
Well,
degrading gene.
this makes sense.
In humans, it's much lower, but still very substantial at like 35%.
More than Oxalobacter famiginis is your point.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
essentially, like, and that's something that we'll probably talk about more directly in a little bit. But so oxalate degrading bacteria are like it ranges a huge diversity of bacteria in our gut. And what they do obviously to help prevent stones is they degrade the oxalate, and so that lowers the amount of oxalate that goes into circulation and lowers the amount that can be caught up in stones. Another big area that they help, and there's a lot of clinical and animal studies that show this as well, is that they produce short chain fatty acids, and particularly a lot of the research has focused on butyrate, but other research has found like similar sorts of things for acetic acid and like succinate and stuff like that. So what's important about butyrate is that it is a fuel source for our intestinal epithelial cells, and so it directly goes to support our intestinal barrier function. And why that's important is because the more effective our barrier, the less oxalate or other uremic toxins like uric acid and things like that can get through and go on to form
Into
stones
our
and things
bodies.
like that. We also know that on the flip side of things, that bacteria can actually produce urea, and so it could potentially and we don't have a lot of data. Like our data is limited to doing some like uric acid assays in the gut microbiota after we give some mice antibiotics. And so we see like if we give them antibiotics, that the uric acid levels actually go down.
Hmm.
And there's a fair amount of data that now that supports that bacteria in the gut produce uremic or uric acid.
Hmm.
Um, and so those are kind of like the three, main known ways right now that the gut microbiota influences kidney stone formation. But like we talked about earlier, the interaction between the gut microbiota and sort of training the immune system has a lot to do with it because,
Hmm.
the inflammation and things like that really play an important part in directly forming kidney stones. And so, if the bacteria produce a host environment that lowers inflammation overall, then that would help to lower systemic inflammation and kidney stone formation in that way as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so many things. So if we had to summarize all of those bacteria, eat a lot of the oxalate from the healthy foods that we eat, right? So then that oxalate doesn't end up in our urine where it can form stones. It
Yeah.
can also produce all this good stuff, specifically the butyrate and other short chain fatty acids, which can help basically make our intestines work better and stop bad stuff from leaking into our body, and
Right.
also helps reduce inflammation, which directly plays a role in promoting kidney stone formation. Inflammation is not great for kidney stone formation. Would you say those are kind of the three main ways?
Yeah.
Was that a good
Yeah.
synopsis?
Yeah. I think those are the major things that we kind of know about right now. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, which is fascinating. If you, this is kind of a left field question, but if you had to give like a percentage or a level of importance of the gut microbiome when it comes to kidney stone formation, you also might be biased because of your area of research. But how important is it? This is like kind of a fun extra thing, or is this like super, super critical to our understanding of kidney stones?
So I'll give some context. And so the different factors, I guess, that can contribute to kidney stones are your host genetics, your gut microbiota, urinary tract microbiota, your diet, and lifestyle things like how much exercise you get and things like that. So the way that I think about it is that your host genetics, there's a lot of, I don't know, it's a big trend and a lot of studies that are done on, what genes or gene variants in your host genome facilitate kidney stone formation. And they're important. So there's things like genetic hyperoxaluria, where, based on differences in your genes, you produce a lot of endogenous oxalate. There's also like cysteine stone formers, which are very tied to host genetics. Um, Outside of like those severe cases, I would say like host genetics plays a very little role.
Hmm.
And the diet also, there's a lot of like clear known links. And so I think that the diet plays a big role, but in terms of how much each of the different areas play in terms of kidney stone formation, I would say the gut microbiota directly plays an outsized role. Um, I mean, I would argue, I don't know if I put a percentage on it, like 40 to 50% if you,
That's huge.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think so. I think like diet and exercise are probably like the biggest factors, but then like, that also goes through the gut microbiota.
Right. You can't
Um,
really tease them out separately. Hmm.
Yeah, and so like, and the other really critical part about the gut microbiota is it's highly modifiable. And so, in both human and animal studies, if we do a drastic change in our diet, you see a massive shift in your gut microbiota within 2 to 3 days. And so it changes very quickly. And there's also things like, probiotics and also like I'm a huge fan of fermented foods. And so I like on a daily basis, I eat like 4 or 5 different kinds of fermented foods like pretty regularly.
Okay.
Taking kind of like, a microbiome first approach to my own health. Like I'm
Hmm.
my own science experiment, right?
Yeah. Um, Okay, that leads directly into my next question. I think we've done a very good job of helping people understand how all of these bacteria all over our body are helping or hurting our kidney stone prevention efforts. What can we do about it? Do we have to take a probiotic? Should we take a probiotic? Because I know that you can get Oxalobacter formigenes or probiotics. They're available. Should people take them?
So that is a loaded and kind of complicated question. And so people scientists have known about Oxalobacter for 50 years. And, it's this oxalate degrading specialist that requires oxalate for growth. And, on the face of it, it sounds like this is a great way to reduce our urinary oxalate, right? And so it's been used as a probiotic in 12 clinical intervention studies that I can recall off the top of my head. It has successfully reduced urine oxalate significantly for the study population 50% of the time. And so it's basically 50% effective. And in every single clinical trial, there's a huge variability in results.
Hmm.
And so the enthusiasm for using oxalobacter as like a probiotic therapy to reduce urine oxalate has waned a lot. And people are still doing these studies. There's actually a study that I was kind of tangentially involved with that was published this year, actually, very, very recently. And a lot of what we have been doing research-wise is trying to figure out, why does oxalobacter fail? And so we've in this recent clinical trial that was just published, and also we've done a lot of preclinical work and microbiological work, so just focusing on the bacteria as well. And so what we have found, like I said earlier, is that there's a huge diversity of oxalate degrading bacteria. And if we put oxalobacter onto a background of an already robust, diverse oxalate degrading microbiome, it does nothing. But if we start with very low levels of oxalate degrading bacteria and you add oxalobacter onto that, it has a significant effect. It reduces your urine
Interesting.
oxalate.
Hmm.
And so the effect of oxalobacter as a probiotic is directly tied to the oxalate degrading bacteria that you already have in your gut. If you start in a valley, oxalobacter works
Oh,
well. If you start on a mountain peak, it does nothing.
not gonna do anything. Huh.
And so it's very contextual. And like I said, the microbiota between people is highly variable, and it's impacted by things like your diet, your history of antibiotic use, and things like
Hmm.
that. And even in the healthiest population, the prevalence of oxalobacter is like 16 to like 30%. So it's not very common.
And
And
even lower in stone formers, I believe, correct?
yeah, I mean, again, it's like one of those things. If you do like case control studies with oxalobacter, it's like 40% of the time it's associated with disease or negatively associated with disease. 60% of the time it's not, and there's also a lot of variation. And so like depends on the study that you look at. And so it's really it's really
We
the
don't really know,
entire.
it seems. We're just not sure what to do with this guy overall,
Yeah,
it
I mean,
seems.
so like what we need is better, like in order to say, oxalobacter or some other probiotic works to lower urinary oxalate, we need to have like better selection criteria for who we test it on.
Hmm.
And we have that data now, and that's kind of like what we're planning on doing in the near future is, we know how to select the best patients to like how they where they would respond to a probiotic.
Hmm.
And so to robustly test, do you respond to a probiotic? Can that improve your oxalate levels? We just need to pick a better population, and we
Hmm.
know what to pick against now.
Yeah, yeah. Would you say a more effective probiotic strategy, if you did say we should take probiotics, is to just take a general probiotic that just like increases the diversity of our gut microbiome in general, rather
So,
than trying to target this particular Oformycetes bacteria?
so a lot of the common probiotics do have oxalate degrading strains, like a lot of the lactobacilli
Hmm.
can do oxalate degradation. But like I said, like that still falls into the same pitfall of like if you already have a lot of oxalate degrading bacteria, like it's probably not going to help.
Yeah.
Uh, So I think, having a more targeted approach both on the probiotic side and on the patient side
Hmm.
is what's really needed. With that said, we've done a lot of kind of like, minimally sufficient communities of bacteria in trying to figure out like what best supports oxalate homeostasis. And we do think that other bacteria, if you include them in a probiotic, do work better than oxalobacter. But I mean, it's still something that we're looking at. So some of our next studies is, having all of our, participants or whatever start with a low baseline of oxalate degrading bacteria and then adding in oxalobacter or oxalate bacter and these other bacteria
Hmm.
and seeing which one is more effective.
Yeah. So it sounds like taking a probiotic generally is not going to be your first line recommendation for helping to improve your gut microbiome. It seems like we still need to learn quite a bit about what is best and for whom and those types of things.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, taking a probiotic isn't going to hurt anything.
It's not a risk, other
And
than the
it,
cost, I suppose.
Yeah, other than the cost,
Hmm.
and it may help. Like if you're if you're one of the people that have low oxalate degrading bacteria to start with, then it would help. Um,
Also, if you have high urine oxalate to begin with as well, I think that's another important point in all of this, right? Because
yeah,
many
so
people don't. Wanted to
yeah,
throw that in there too.
yeah, of course. Like if you have low urine oxalate to begin with, then like yeah,
What's the
taking
point?
an oxalate, yeah, right.
Hmm. Yeah. So, what might be a better strategy to support a healthy gut microbiome for kidney stones?
So I would say, like one of the things that we know helps from some of our clinical and our preclinical studies, fiber helps to increase, butyrate and the short chain fatty acids that improves your intestinal barrier function, but also lowers systemic inflammation.
Hmm.
And so it's one of those areas that like we still need more research on, but like it's we have a lot of data that support that idea still. Um, One of the current recommendations by like a lot of like nephrologists and urologists is actually to consume a low oxalate diet. But the problem with that is that it's twofold. One is that if you lower your oxalate intake, you lower the abundance of oxalate degrading bacteria.
Because you're
So
killing
we
them
know,
off because you don't give them food to help people,
right.
right? Yep.
So we know from a lot of clinically and like preclinical studies that as you give oxalate in your diet, you increase the oxalate degrading bacteria, and we've directly pinpointed, we've directly shown that oxalate degradation in the context of oxalate exposure gives those bacteria a selective advantage over other bacteria that can't degrade oxalate, and so you're really strongly selecting for your oxalate degrading bacteria. And so I think, the other factor in that low oxalate diet is, the foods that have high oxalate are the healthy foods, like your leafy greens, nuts and
That's
berries and stuff like that, that we typically recommend in like, DASH style diets that, promote
are
health.
shown to prevent stones or associated with a low risk of stones.
Right,
Mhm.
right. And so, you know, from my understanding from my own research, like having those healthy foods that they may be high in oxalate, they actually help to prevent stones. And there's literature back from like the 80s or 90s that looked at people on like a vegetarian diet versus like a kind of more of a normal non-vegetarian diet. And vegetarians, even though they were consuming high oxalate, had a lower incidence of stones.
Mhm.
And so there's direct clinical data that supports that idea as
Yeah.
well.
Well, and again and again and again, we see that the Mediterranean and DASH style diet, which are very high in oxalate by definition, right? Because there's tons of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. Those are consistently associated with a lower risk of stones. I talk about this all the time in my
Yeah,
content. And I think that there are many reasons why those dietary patterns, despite their higher oxalate content, can help with stones. And I think this whole fiber content and ironically the oxalate content of them directly on the gut microbiome is one aspect of them as to why we see those associations.
yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
And like I said, I mean, the diet is the biggest source of nutrients for the gut microbiota, and like it's the biggest source of modification, I guess, like the best way that you can modify your gut microbiota to promote health, right?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And so really the sort of status quo low oxalate diet recommendation could be making oxalate worse potentially because we're
Yeah,
killing off all of these bacteria that are helping us break down those bacteria, right? We're sort of reducing our ability to tolerate a higher oxalate diet, a higher oxalate healthy diet, if you will.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I think another, and this might get me in the weeds a little bit. We also recommend a very not high calcium, adequate calcium diet for people with calcium oxalate stones,
Yeah.
which does, and correct me if I'm wrong, would reduce the oxalate availability to those oxalate degrading bacteria. I think we certainly still should be recommending calcium for sure because we know that that has a drastic impact on kidney stone formation. But when we have this combination of a high calcium or regular calcium and low oxalate diet, it's sort of like the worst case scenario for those little bacteria down there.
Yeah. Um, so I think a lot of the literature supports that, but there are some, data that says that, at least for like oxalobacter and some of these other oxalate degrading bacteria, they can still access the oxalate even if it's in the calcium oxalate form.
Oh,
And so
okay. I didn't know. Okay.
and actually like the way that oxalobacter was first isolated is they took your culture media, and then they put calcium oxalate in it, and so the calcium oxalate is this white precipitate. And so what they did is they grew bacteria from like rumen fluid of sheep or whatever, and then on the plates if the bacteria were degrading oxalate, you saw this clear zone around the bacteria, and it's because they were degrading the calcium oxalate. They were getting rid of the white precipitate.
Okay.
And so I do think based on the literature that the calcium oxalate form is less available to bacteria, but they can still use
Hmm.
it. And
And
so like
and we know that calcium is good for us, so we shouldn't avoid it. But it
yeah.
sounds like perhaps those concerns that I had of exacerbating the situation with eating enough calcium perhaps is a bit unfounded.
Yeah, I mean I think it's there, but probably not as bad as what you might think. So,
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Okay, thank you for clearing that up.
yeah.
Well, as we kind of near the end of our episode, do you have any final thoughts for our audience? Any take-home messages, things that we didn't get to? We covered a lot in this episode. What do you want people to know about the gut microbiome and kidney stones?
So I would say we kind of touched on this, but that the gut microbiota I see as one of the most modifiable aspects of our health. And so really, like I said, I kind of take a microbiome first approach to my own health. And so, that has led me to, modify my diet in ways that improves the health of our microbiota. And also things like exercise and stuff like that helps to improve our own microbiota. And so I think, historically, we have always thought of bacteria as being sort of a bad guy. And so they cause infection. They have led to like plagues and things like that. But, we should really reframe our mind to think, those bad functions that bacteria provide are the rare case.
Hmm.
And for the most part, bacteria are doing very beneficial things for our health.
They're our
And
friends.
we should approach our microbiome that way.
Yeah. Yeah, awesome. And I love that you said that it's the most modifiable piece of our health, and diet and what you do with your life, like moving your body, is such a huge part, if not the biggest thing by far that you can do to improve that community of bacteria.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. This was a fascinating episode. I learned things as always. We'll have to have you back again in a year or two when things are totally different and we have updates in this area of research.
Yeah,
All right.
thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more help with kidney stones, check out my website, www.thekidneydietitian.org. For more personalized help from me, check out my online course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. VIP enrollment includes help directly from me. I can't wait to see you there and help you prevent kidney stones. Have a great day.